Welcome to Beyond the Balance Sheet, the podcast that helps advisors, clinical professionals, and affluent families understand the complexities of issues related to our mental, physical, and emotional well-being. Our co-hosts, Arden O'Connor and Diana Clark, will interview a series of guests on a range of topics, providing informative content and practical tools for professionals and families to consider. Here are your hosts, Arden and Diana.
Hi, and welcome to an episode of Beyond the Balance Sheet. Arden O'Connor, my co-host, and I are thrilled to talk with Andrew Caspersen about his personal story of falling down and a story of getting back up. We really appreciate his willingness to talk to us. One of the best parts about doing this podcast and about doing this work is that we get to hear these personal stories and have insight into other lives that we wouldn't ordinarily know about. So Andrew lives and works in New York City. He has done a stint in federal prison in 2016 for defrauding those who trusted him. But he is today interested in sharing his experience of recovery so that not only does he provide a cautionary tale for those who might be close to the edge, but also to show that help and healing are possible. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you, Diana.
So our first question is, like everybody else in our audience, tell us the story. Just in your own words, tell us the story.
So for those of your listeners who have spent some time in 12-step meetings, I'll try to condense the typical long-form qualification statement to a 2 to 3 minute summary. And I guess if I had to provide a 10-second summary, when I started recovery, my first month in April 2016, a friend of mine in AA gave me a book called The Return of the Prodigal Son. And it's something that I immediately related to, about a young son who was given everything that he could possibly ask for and still squandered it away. And that's, basically my story on steroids. So I was raised in a very loving household on an idyllic farm in northern New Jersey. 2 wonderful parents, 3 supportive brothers, great extended family and community. And I just couldn't have asked for a better environment to grow up in. I was also offered every educational opportunity I could ever dream for, whether it was, Montessori preschool all the way to an Ivy League law school and everything in between. But much more than that, it was a loving and stimulating environment. My family emphasized traditional values of, work ethic and treating each other with respect, and many of those that I wish to emulate today. And despite all of that, I went down a different path. And there are a lot of reasons. I would say that it was made a little easier by my drinking and gambling. And I still remember like it was yesterday. I was 16. I was walking into Foxwood Casino. It had just opened. And I can still hear the buzz of the slot machines and the smell that terrible but somehow alluring sense of the casino, and sitting down at the blackjack table and feeling the green felt and hearing the cards as they were dealt and looking at excitement as they were turned over. I was mesmerized, and I was truly all in at that moment. I may have not known it, but I was. It didn't help that I won that day. It made it easier to come back. But I suspect I would have returned regardless. And from that point forward, through my own decisions, I decided to drink and gamble more and more as the years progressed. My gambling evolved from casinos to sports betting. In the late 90s, the online sports betting world was kind of created, a little different and harder than it is today. So I only shudder to think of what it would be like, growing up in today's environment. But back then, you would go to the Western Union, you'd wire money to some shady Antiguan casino, and then you'd place your bets, and I did that. And then I evolved it to, market speculation, first just buying stocks on margin before their earnings, and then, stock options, and was able to create limitless bets, no longer constrained by table limits. And for a guy like me that wanted to put all of his cash on a single coin toss bet, it was a perfect opportunity. And I just was all in. And that went on for a long time, a long time. And eventually I crossed that criminal line. A little less than a decade ago, I started taking money from those who trusted me the most. I just wasn't willing to wait until that next liquidity event, whether it was a work bonus or a trust distribution. I just wasn't willing to wait. And I took other people's money and put it alongside my own. And, I gambled it all away. I'm reminded of Einstein's definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. And I was exhibit A. I even kept a spreadsheet showing that if I did these coin toss like bets, I was destined to lose and bankrupt myself every time. And still I continued. And you don't need to put a spreadsheet together to know that eventually you're going to lose a coin toss bet, unless you're Rosencrantz and Hamlet. So it was a path, a very self-destructive path. And I drank more and more. I think of it as kind of putting the mute button on my conscience at the time, just drinking away the guilt and knowing that it'd be easier to do these things. So it was a combination of kind of greasing the wheels of criminal thinking, but also being lured by drinking and gambling along the way. But it was always my decision to move forward, and eventually I lost it all. And I was arrested in March of 2016 and served time in a federal prison. And now I'm piecing my life back together.
Thank you, Andrew, for being vulnerable enough to share such a personal story. And you can feel the energy with both of us sort of witnessing you talk about it in such a candid way. I guess my question is, and I'm sure just based on the way you describe your childhood, was there a moment in time in your journey that you knew you were headed down a path that may, maybe not wind up in the place that you became, in federal prison, but that you knew you were kind of making choices that weren't helpful and that you were headed down a bad path?
Absolutely. And I would describe it as hundreds, probably, moments of clarity. On a regular basis, I knew what I was doing was wrong. I knew it was against, everything that I'd been taught by my parents and my family, and yet I still did it. I would say the moments got clearer and clearer over time as the steps I took were bolder and bolder. And certainly that first crossing of the criminal line, I couldn't believe I was doing it, but still I was doing it. And I would say the clearest moment was probably at the end, when I actually had a chance to get out. President's Weekend 2016, for whatever reason, I had just had an enormous string of good fortune and had made something like 20 times my money over just a few weeks. And so I was sitting in front of my computer that weekend looking at kind of a spreadsheet, and I just couldn't believe what I saw. And it showed that because of the bet I had closed out that Friday, I was sitting on more than $100 million in cash, and I could repay my investors twice over, still have enough to cover my lifetime of losses. And I was thinking, I can't believe this. Like, I never truly believed I would be able to get here, and yet here I am. And I said, I got to stop. I just have to stop. If you think about that old game show, it's like door number 1 and door number 2. For years, I had bankrupted myself over and over again, as long as I continued. So I had a feeling that if I continued, I would not only bankrupt myself, but more importantly, bankrupt the people that I had taken this money from fraudulently. And these weren't just complete strangers. These were people that I loved and knew. And that would be an emotional pain. It would be a financial pain. It would be all sorts of pain for them. And then obviously for me personally, there are lots of reasons not to continue. I knew what I was doing was criminal. I knew I would go to prison. I knew it would probably destroy, the family life that I had that time. I knew that, whatever reputation I had was gone, a career, all those things that we hold on to, dearly in this life. I knew it was all going to be gone. But still, I chose I chose the wrong door. And, rather than just stopping and paying everyone back, I just So at that point, I kind of sort of told myself I would stop, but then Tuesday morning after a long weekend rolled around, and as 9:30 approached, I got a little more nervous, and finally, right as the market opened, I called my broker and I told him to place the entire cash balance on a single options bet. Within 2 weeks, all the money was gone. And a few weeks after that, I tried to desperately raise some more money. By raise, I mean defraud. And I was unsuccessful. And I was arrested Easter weekend 2016. I was carrying at the time a confession. So all I needed to do was basically give the government the password to my computer. It was all there. I threw myself at the mercy of the court. But that moment of clarity, it wasn't clear. It could not have been clearer to me. And so what I lacked was the courage and the discipline to act on it. And that was it.
So you talk about it as courage. You talk about it as decisions you continued to make. What your story speaks to me of is a hijacked brain. And when I talk about that, I'm really asking, is it possible in your understanding that your brain just simply wasn't working well, and that is the definition of addiction?
It's definitely possible. I don't have your expertise to really answer that question. I just know what I experienced. And let me just put it this way. The decisions I was making at that time in my life were very different than decisions I was making earlier in my life. And so something changed.
Right.
And, I put myself in that situation. So it's possible that at that time in my life, I was severely compromised. But it was a result of a lot of decisions earlier. And, had I known the consequences of those early decisions, would I have avoided it? Maybe. But I know now there are lots of things I can do to avoid putting myself in that situation again. Now, because of the damage I did, I'm not likely to be put in a similar situation, but that doesn't mean I still can't destroy my life by itself. And so, for me, if I could have spared my family, friends, clients, colleagues, employer, everyone in my orbit that was so generous to me for so long, if I could have spared them all that pain, but still have personally gone through that experience and be where I am today, I would do it. But because of all that pain, it's something that I never want people to experience again. And that's the reason I'm on this podcast.
It's a great statement. I mean, I think one of the things I always say when our clients come to us and they're desperate for help for somebody who has an addiction issue, whether it's a process compulsivity like gambling or a substance abuse issue, we hear, why my child, are they ever going to be normal? All sorts of fears that family members have. And one thing I always say is that, the assumptions are from family members that their loved one, because of this addiction, because what it's done to their brain, they're going to lead a lesser life. And that has not been the case of the people I know who've gone through recovery. Many of them are better humans than the average person who hasn't had to go through the steps. The steps are an enormously humbling process. I think they make people very self-aware of the damage they've done to others. So I think your sentiment is one that's shared amongst the community of people in recovery, that they wouldn't necessarily wish an outcome that was different for themselves, but for the collateral damage around them, family members, work colleagues, other extended parties, that they wouldn't want their addiction back. But for themselves, they often know themselves better and become, in my opinion, better humans through the process of recovery and healing. I guess one question I have is what role did faith have in this process? Were you a man of faith prior to these experiences? Has it kicked in during your process of recovery?
So I guess I would describe my faith kind of prior to my rock bottom, and still at times, for sure, as very hypocritical. So, I expressed one thing with my words and my outwardly appearance, but I did other things that completely ran opposite to that. So when I say hypocrite, I mean like in the truest sense. And hitting my rock bottom, it freed me, I think, a little bit from, first of all, outward appearances. There was nothing that I could possibly project anymore. there is something beautiful in being publicly humiliated. I will say that loud and clear. It strips away so much pride that a personal humiliation may not expose. So that was kind of step number one for me. It was sadly a necessary step, but that was a gift to be publicly, exposed. And then it was a long process. So it's not like the day I was arrested, I was making lots of great decisions and acting, completely reformed. It's been a long, long process, but I've tried very hard since then to kind of take at least the right steps forward. I would say for me, the most important, aids on that path have been mercy that's brought into my life, completely unmerited grace and mercy. So when I was arrested, I talked before about the prodigal son. I had the same mindset that I thought there was no possible way that I could ever be forgiven for what I had done. And looking back on it, that's a very prideful mindset that my sins were greater than God's love and mercy, but maybe some people can relate to that. You don't have to commit crimes to feel like sometimes you're just in a spot that you just can't recover from, and that your circumstances are just too great. And I realized eventually when people showed me their mercy that that my sins were horrible, but that love was even greater. So for me, the first steps towards that, when people, checked me into a hospital, people I'd hurt, they checked me in, my wife and my family. And then when I was in there, a priest came to visit me. And, rather than, I guess, kind of going through the litany of sins that, that he disapproved of, he just asked me to confess, and there was no conditions attached to it. So I took that opportunity. I just put it all on the table. Everything that I could possibly remember from my whole life, especially the crimes. And I felt such a lightness after that. I felt like I finally had some hope. And hope is a powerful thing. I will tell you, when you are just starting recovery, like, hope is water in the desert. So that was like a very big first step. While I was still in the hospital, I attended my first AA meeting. And then when I got out, I wasn't quite ready to get, returned to home yet. So I stayed at a church for a couple months, and it was a very, very restorative, peaceful, prayerful environment to kind of reconnect. And I would say, again, the theme of mercy and forgiveness. So I was sitting there in church knowing that I had been given all this unmerited forgiveness by others I had hurt, but yet I was still holding on to these resentments myself. Who was I? So I just decided at that moment just to let it all go, all the way up to forgiving by name the hijackers that, killed my girlfriend on September 11th. And, I just decided to let it go, and holding me back for too long. That was just for me personally. I can't speak to other people's experiences with that. But personally, that was a life-altering experience. And so, to recall kind of the skin tingling and lightness from that and moving forward, it was really transformative. And so I've tried to embrace that, in my life. It's a continuing learning process. But I think that's when my faith became less hypocritical and a little more action-oriented.
So when you talk about faith being action-oriented, trust building is also action-oriented. Have you been successful in rebuilding trust with those people that you had, not been trustworthy with before in your illness?
Yeah, that would be an understatement. So, and I think it's too much for me to ask for that type of, rebuilding of trust. It was too big of a hole. And so, financially and emotionally, the betrayal, was enormous, and I'll go back to faith a little bit. So, for those of you Dante fans out there, in the Inferno, the ninth circle of hell is reserved for those who betray the trust of others. And some of us feel like we're going through our own personal hells, even before we're actually punished by society. That's how I felt. I felt like I put myself in a spot that was lower than low and that I couldn't get out of. And so, now that I've been given this gift of kind of slowly climbing out of that circle and, working my way up, I'm not asking to restore the trust of the people I betrayed, but instead, I'm just looking for new opportunities to serve different types of clients. So obviously not in a financial or fiduciary capacity anymore. But I'll give you a few examples. So when I was in prison, I had a couple jobs. The first job was a janitor. And so, I made sure that the toilets were scrubbed clean, the floors, were mopped, tables, etc. And, for someone who had, had a somewhat successful career on Wall Street to go to making $5.25 a month, scrubbing toilets, that if I wanted to kind of say, well, I shouldn't be doing this, that probably would have been tempting. But instead, I tried to view it through the lens of service and client, action. And so my new clients were my fellow, prisoners, inmates, residents, whatever you want to call, us. And all of a sudden I had purpose because I was serving people, and that goes back to a lot of the foundations of whether it's religious faith or 12-step program. The value of service is immense in providing, a concrete way to get through your day. And then my second job, was probably a little easier to find purpose, was actually as a GED instructor. And that was an amazing, amazing job, probably my favorite, job up to that date. And helping people who hadn't made it through high school all of a sudden get their diploma, and, working with 6, people to actually get that diploma so they'd be better positioned to get a job. When you look at the rates of recidivism coming out of prison, a lot of it depends upon was the person employed in the first 3 months or not. Because, you can make every kind of noble decision you want, but when it comes to actually feeding your family and you're in a different situation than I am, a lot of people find themselves, cutting corners again when they get out of prison. So if I could kind of help them through GED, that was what a gift that was. I mean, that made my experience so much more purpose driven and kind of prepared me actually to be a dad when I got out to, start going through these, these like kindergarten and first grade workbooks again. So that was a real gift. So that's a way to serve, different kinds of clients and not ask, for restoration of trust, on the people that I had betrayed, but instead just to find new ways to serve. And then, when I got out, all of a sudden I found out about recovery coaching and the recovery community. And so there's just all different ways that you can help people. And it doesn't have to be addiction. People struggle with all sorts of things. And sometimes it's just, you want to listen. I don't have to tell my story. I could just listen.
How do you stay active in the recovery community now?
Well, it's evolved. So I guess I'll kind of go back in time and take it to the present day. So, when I started, I was very heavily involved in Alcoholics Anonymous and Gamblers Anonymous. And as I went into prison, those programs were less available. But some of us kind of, bootstrapped our own program of recovery, within Lewisburg. And then when I was admitted to a drug and alcohol program, that was like a 24-hour program where we were eating and sleeping and studying recovery and helping each other. And that was pretty cool. I mean, it's one thing to kind of attend a 12-step meeting and, the Upper East Side, for instance. Another thing to share your story with someone who comes from a very, very different background and who wasn't given the opportunities I was given, and, who has had different drugs of choice. And so I learned probably more, in my time in prison than I have at any other time in my life. It was a real education. And just the kind of the human experience when you're living with 150 people in one large room, kind of bunk to bunk to bunk, you can't just live on an island. You can't shut your door at night and just say, I want to kind of spend some time with myself. You have to immerse yourself, in other people's lives and experiences, and you have to share your own. And so that was my recovery, and then when I got out, I kind of slowly re-entered, more traditional forms of recovery and, started learning about recovery coaching, and have tried to find new ways to, improve lifestyles, and so learning about, nutrition, for instance, or, myself, I mentioned before, I've been the beneficiary of mercy, and that probably more from my, wife and immediate family than anyone else. And, while our marriage didn't survive, what I put her through, we now have an amazing co-parenting relationship. And so, I've tried to kind of immerse myself in that recovery world. So learning from people who have been, through, family disruptions or divorces and those type of groups, and being both a source of support as well as, a recipient of support. And so it's really an evolving but very interactive process.
What an amazing half an hour we've just spent. What I want to know lastly, though, is for our audience, what would be, if you were going to cull down your experience, what would be the one thing you would want the audience to walk away with? I know what I'm walking away with. What would you like us to walk away with?
Well, I wouldn't presuppose, kind of a lessons learned summary, but I'll just say that, a couple things. So maybe I'll evade your kind of one thing question. First is that anything is possible. So both kind of going down as well as, when the sun rises. So I would say going down, when I turned away from kind of the love of my family and the grace of God that it was extended through my clients, my employer, my friends, everyone around me. When I turned away from that grace, there was a lot, that was possible. And boy, did I experience that, darkness. But then, when I hit my rock bottom and I was no longer, I guess, trying to kind of, hold up this artifice while, feeding the black hole of gambling, which, by the way, is all consuming. And the more you feed it, the more it wants. And first it consumes you, and then it starts bringing in the people around you. So, when I was able to start turning away from the black hole and stop feeding it, and I was able to turn a little bit towards God's grace, anything seemed possible coming out of it. It was really glorious and miraculous. I never would have thought that, So that's kind of my general, airy, takeaway from the experience is never assume that things can't get worse if someone is struggling, if they're not adequately addressing their situation, but also never assume that things can't get better if for whatever reason they're given kind of a renewed purpose. So that's kind of the 30,000. I would say on a more, granular level, I've learned the importance of a holistic approach to recovery. So what does that mean? I mentioned faith, obviously that's important, but there's a lot of pillars. I carry around this card with me. Mm-hmm. I'll embarrass my kids here. So, in case I ever get in a jam, I can always look at this card and know, what I need to look forward to get through the day. And this is important because sometimes, you can be the world's best navigator, but if there are clouds on the horizon, you may not be able to see the stars or the moon or whatever gets you, from port to port. And when the storm comes and you can't see anything, you need something tangible. You can't look to the heavens any longer. So I got these steps in the back, and they tell me, have you done these things today? Have you helped a stranger? Have you prayed the rosary? Have you exercised? Have you counted your blessings? Have you prayed for a victim? Have you prayed for a perpetrator? Have you thanked a friend? And then there's the emergency checklist, like break this glass. Have you confessed? Have you gone to a meeting? Talked to a sponsor, reached out to your safety net of, support, and on and on and on. And then I have a reminder on here, that, so one of my favorite saints is Saint Faustina. And she said that suffering is the greatest treasure on earth. It purifies the soul. And if you're struggling, whether it's an addiction or just life in general, often it's the resistance to suffering that makes things worse. And man, was that my life for so long. And it's only kind of now trying to embrace the suffering, kind of just jumping into the wave, to use that old, a truism, that it adds purpose to a difficult time, and it keeps you from doing something really stupid, And so when you talk about kind of the hijacking the brain, well, let's get that back on the tracks. And this card helps me keep it on the tracks.
This was great. I think it's a great note to end on. And I love that it's a card that's laminated that you can have as a reminder, because I do think in moments of desperation, we're often searching for something immediately around us to give us light. People say meditate. And I always say, if you're really upset, don't do that rather than have a drink. And I always say, it takes the effort of actually turning over the phone and putting up, for me, it's Insight Timer. So I think the more things we can do that can jerk us back into our sense of purpose and just give us a moment of pause before we do something we might regret are helpful.
100%.
Any of them. Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining us today for Beyond the Balance Sheet podcast and what is now a video option. If you have enjoyed this episode, please go to your platform of choice and like us, and we look forward to seeing you and talking with you next time.
Thank you for listening to Beyond the Balance Sheet, a podcast designed to help advisors, clinical professionals, and affluent families solve some of their biggest medical, psychiatric, and emotional challenges. Visit beyondthebalancesheet.com to read more about our guests and resources, and sign up for our newsletter.